May 13, 1943, the Tunisian desert. Previous 3 years of war had produced settled over the scorched earth between Bizerte and Cape Bon, on the northeastern tip of North Africa. It was not the silence of victory. It was the silence of finality. The kind of quiet that descends after artillery ceases not, because the battle is paused, but because the battle is over, permanently, irrevocably, and without appeal. The sand here had been the stage for one of the most brilliant military campaigns in modern history. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had transformed this bleached and merciless terrain into a theater of tactical genius. His Afrika Korps had pushed through Libya and into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and the lifeline of the British Empire itself. For nearly 3 years, German soldiers had lived in this unforgiving wilderness, rationing water, surviving on meager provisions, breathing dust into lungs already raw from heat and exhaustion. They had fought with ferocity and discipline. They had believed in something. They had believed in the fatherland, in the rightness of their cause, in the propaganda that poured from the Reich's Ministry of Truth like a river of certainty, that Germany was the superior nation, that America was a weak and decadent democracy incapable of real sacrifice, that the soldiers of the United States were soft, men from a soft land who would crumble under the weight of true German resolve. On May 13, 1943, that belief collided with reality in the open desert. The last remnants of the Afrika Korps surrendered to British and American forces. The total number of Axis prisoners taken in Tunisia in those final days was staggering. 275,000 men, among the largest single surrender of the war. They laid down rifles that had crossed a continent. They raised hands that had once saluted the swastika with absolute conviction. And in doing so, they began an involuntary journey that would take them not to the brutal prison, pens they had been warned about, not to the starvation camps they had been assured awaited them at the hands of their decadent enemies, but to something so profoundly unexpected, so materially overwhelming, so philosophically disorienting, that many of them would never fully recover from the experience. They were going to America, and America was about to serve them ice cream, years having tasted very little sweetness of any kind. The soldiers fighting in Africa were not immune to these shortages. Their rations, while maintained at levels sufficient for combat effectiveness, were never generous, never indulgent, never the kind of meal a man could sit down to and feel genuinely, warmly, abundantly fed. They were sustained. They were never satisfied. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had worked hard to reframe this scarcity as virtue. Sacrifice was strength, the Reich proclaimed. Hardship was the forge in which German character was refined. The Americans, by contrast, those people across the ocean who had not yet known the discipline of war on their home soil, they lived in excess, in waste, in the kind of moral softness that prosperity breeds. The propaganda posters of the time depicted Americans as materialistic, racially impure, driven by commerce rather than conviction. American soldiers, the Reich's messaging insisted, were boys playing at war, men who had grown up too comfortable to understand genuine resolve. This was not merely political rhetoric. For many German soldiers, it was simply accepted fact, part of the intellectual air they breathed. It was what they had been told, repeatedly, systematically, from their earliest years in the Hitler Youth, through their military training, through every newspaper and radio, broadcast and official communication they had ever received. America was weak. America was decadent. America was a country of soft people living soft lives. And if one day those soft people became their captors, they would be capable of great cruelty, because that is what weak nations do when they briefly hold power. They were certain of this. They were wrong about everything. The processing of prisoners began even before they left Africa. At the North African ports of Bizerte, Tunis, and Oran, something remarkable and thoroughly disorienting occurred. The German prisoners, haggard and lean from years of desert warfare and inadequate rations, were given meals, not bread and water prisoner rations, not the cold, thin gruel of a punitive internment. They were given the same meals being served to the American soldiers guarding them. Hot food, substantial food, food in quantities that many of these prisoners had not encountered in 4 years of military service. Some men stood in line disbelieving what was placed before them. Some looked at the portions and assumed it was a trick, an elaborate deception designed to humiliate them or extract information. An officer among them, reportedly, stared at his plate for a long moment before a fellow prisoner leaned over and said simply, "Eat." They ate, and the food was better in quality, in variety, in quantity, than their own officers back in Germany had been receiving. For men who had been told that the enemy lived in weakness, this was the first quiet, impossible, deeply unsettling crack in the architecture of everything they believed. The 3-week voyage across the Atlantic compounded the confusion. Aboard the Liberty ships that ferried them across the ocean, the German prisoners continued to be fed with a regularity and generosity that defied their understanding of wartime. The Americans, even at sea, threw away food. They discarded provisions. They simply discarded them, for reasons as ordinary as mild spoilage or excess production. Milk that had been left unrefrigerated a few hours too long was poured into the ocean, not rationed more carefully, not redistributed or diluted, poured away. Men who had watched German children going without milk stared at that milk disappearing into the Atlantic and could not find words in their language adequate to describe what they were witnessing. They were watching a nation so materially abundant that it could afford to waste, casually and without ceremony, what their own nation counted as precious. By the time those Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic, delivering as many as 30,000 prisoners per month at the program's peak, something had already begun to shift in the minds of the men aboard them. Not a conversion, not a transformation, something quieter and more destabilizing than that. A question. The first, small, terrifying question. What if what we were told was not true? June 4th, 1943, Mexia, Texas. The residents of this small central Texas town witnessed a sight that had never before appeared on its quiet streets and would never appear again. A column of 1,850 soldiers in uniform marched with measured, deliberate cadence down the main thoroughfare of the town. They were tanned from the African sun, physically fit despite their weeks at sea, and they moved, as one historian would later describe, with a defiant stride, the stride of men who had surrendered in body but had not yet surrendered in spirit. These were veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps, and they were on their way to a newly constructed prisoner of war camp. The townspeople lined the streets and watched. Some were uncertain what to feel. These were the enemy, but they did not look like monsters. They looked, in the clear Texas June light, like young men. They looked like someone's sons. The camp that received them was one of hundreds being constructed and operated across the United States in response to the sudden and historic responsibility the American government had assumed when Britain, exhausted and strained beyond its domestic capacity, had asked the United States to absorb the massive prisoner of war burden generated by the Tunisian collapse. American authorities had consented with some reluctance and considerable urgency. They had never done anything like this before. The infrastructure required was immense. By the war's end, more than 700 prisoner of war camps would be spread across the United States, concentrated primarily in the South, the Southwest, the Great Plains, and the Midwest, areas where land was available, populations were sparse, and the labor shortage caused by the mobilization of millions of American men into military service was most acutely felt. More than 475,000 German prisoners of war would be distributed across those camps by 1945. It was the largest single internment program in American history, and it unfolded in almost total silence from the perspective of popular memory. Most Americans, even today, have never heard of it. In those camps, something happened that no official in Washington or Berlin had planned or anticipated. An experiment in ideology, conducted not through formal instruction or coercive persuasion, but through the quiet, relentless, undeniable evidence of daily life. It began with a simple, transparent object. It began with a bottle of Coca-Cola. To a German soldier in 1943, a bottle of Coca-Cola was, at most, a rumor. Germany had a Coca-Cola subsidiary, and a domestic substitute called Fanta had been developed. During the war years, when the American product could no longer be supplied, Fanta production peaked at 3 million cases annually in Germany, a nation of over 80 million people. In America, during that same year, 1943, Coca-Cola delivered 60 million cases to the military alone. The disparity was not merely numerical, it was theological. In Germany, the soft drink was a scarce, occasional treat. In America, it cost 5 cents, a single nickel. It was served at every meal in the prison camps. It was available without limitation in the camp commissary. It sat in cases beside the food lines, cold, dark, fizzing, capped with its familiar cap, available to any man who had a nickel. And those men, paid 80 cents a day for work outside the camps, had nickels. An ordinary American laborer had nickels. A schoolchild had nickels. There was no rationing on Coca-Cola. There was no queue, no allocation, no official permission required. It was simply there, always. The way water is simply there. The way air is simply there. One must linger on that moment, the first time a prisoner reached for one of those bottles. He had likely seen American soldiers drinking them on the transport ships, or heard about them from fellow prisoners who had arrived earlier. He approached the table where they sat in rows, wet with condensation in the summer heat. That curved contour of glass catching the light in a way that was almost artificial, almost theatrical, like a prop from a propaganda film. He lifted it. He felt the weight and the cold of it in his hand. He tilted it back and drank, and the sweetness arrived. Clean, cold, carbonated, immediate, in a body that had been rationing sweetness for years. One veteran, recorded in post-war accounts, said that the first taste of Coca-Cola in an American prison camp was the moment he began, however unconsciously, to doubt everything. Not because a soft drink had persuaded him of anything political, but because the mere existence of this drink, in this quantity, at this price, made possible by this economy, meant that Germany had told him a lie. The food at the camps did not begin and end with Coca-Cola. The scale and variety of what was served to German prisoners of war in American camps has been documented in diaries, memoirs, letters home, and, post-war, testimony with a consistency that removes all doubt about its essential accuracy. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, in the mountains of Cumberland County, a German officer named Gerhard Hennes, prisoner number 31G3619, a communications specialist from Rommel's Panzer Armee Africa, captured in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, arrived through the camp gates on October 12th of that year. It was Columbus Day. Hennes would later write about his experience in a memoir entitled The Barbed Wire, POW in the USA, published in 2004, and it stands as one of the most detailed and credible personal accounts of what the American prison camp experience meant to a German soldier shaped by the ideology of the Reich. Hennes described the breakfast at Camp Crossville with a precision that suggests memory still struggling to accommodate its own disbelief decades later. There were scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, fresh orange juice or V8 juice, hot cakes soaked in maple syrup, cereals of multiple varieties. All of this was not a holiday meal, not a special occasion, not a deliberate display staged for visiting officials. It was Tuesday breakfast. It was what they served every morning, because it was what the camp possessed in ordinary, unremarkable, taken-for-granted abundance. Dinner brought breaded pork chops, string beans, corn muffins, and Jell-O. Seconds were permitted. They were always permitted. Hennes wrote what may be the most quietly devastating sentence in all the literature of the German prisoner experience in America. In Germany, at that same moment in 1943, children were going to bed with less. Women in Berlin were standing in lines for bread. The Reich was consuming itself, tightening its belt another notch. With every month of a war it could no longer sustain economically. And in a pine-ringed compound in the Tennessee mountains, German prisoners of war were pushing plates of pork chops away from themselves because they were full. The cognitive dissonance of that reality was not something that could be dismissed or rationalized. It sat in the stomach alongside the food. It pressed against the ribs. It would not leave. The ice cream came in the summer. Camp Shelby in Mississippi had an ice cream machine that produced 50 gallons daily during the warmer months. At every camp across the South and Midwest, where the summer heat descended, with its full subtropical weight, ice cream was not a reward, not a treat earned through compliance or good behavior. It was served as a matter of institutional routine, with the same bureaucratic indifference that characterized the distribution of everything else in the camp, always in at least 3 flavors: chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, presented as if there were nothing unusual about it. Because for the Americans administering the camps, there was nothing unusual about it. Ice cream was what one ate in summer. Ice cream was what one served. The concept of it as a luxury, as an almost mythological sweetness reserved for the privileged and the rare, did not exist in the American frame of reference. It existed entirely and overwhelmingly in the German one. When the first bowls of ice cream arrived in front of prisoners who had not tasted anything like it in years, men who associated sweetness with scarcity and dessert with special occasion, the effect was, by multiple accounts, physical. Men who had received medals for valor in North Africa sat in wooden mess halls in Mississippi and Tennessee and felt something break open inside them that they did not have adequate emotional vocabulary to describe. They ate their ice cream, and some of them wept. The chocolate bars cost 10 cents. 10 cents at the camp commissary for a full-sized chocolate bar from any of 5 major American manufacturers. In Germany, chocolate had essentially vanished from ordinary civilian life by 1943, available only in limited quantities to military personnel, often as a functional stimulant rather than a pleasure. In the United States, children bought chocolate bars with their pocket money after school. The 10-cent price was not a premium. It was not a wartime luxury pricing. It was simply what chocolate cost, what it had always cost, what it would continue to cost, because chocolate was not remarkable in America. The prisoners did have dimes. Under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, I document the American military administration followed with a scrupulousness that itself astonished. Many of the prisoners, enlisted men who were assigned to work details outside. The camps were paid 80 cents per day. Officers received up to $20 per month. These payments were not made in cash, which could facilitate escape, but in camp scrip redeemable at the commissary or placed into savings. Accounts for collection after repatriation. The American government calculated the prisoners' wages at a rate equivalent to what American Army privates received, $21 per month, because the Geneva Convention required equivalent compensation. They were paid not out of generosity, but out of legal obligation. But the effect was the same. A prisoner working an agricultural labor detail for a Nebraska farmer, pulling weeds from bean rows or stacking hay bales in the August heat, earned enough in a single day's work to purchase 16 bottles of Coca-Cola. 80 cents, 16 bottles, each costing a nickel, each representing, to a mind formed by the ideology of scarcity and sacrifice, a small and recurring act of ideological subversion. The work itself was part of the education. America's agricultural sector had been depleted by the mobilization of millions of young men into military service. By mid-1942, more than 2 million workers had left the nation's farms. Fields needed hands. Orchards needed pickers. Sugar beet operations in Nebraska. Cotton farms in Texas and Arkansas. Canning operations in Michigan and California. All of them were short the labor necessary to bring in their harvests and sustain the food production that the war effort required. The German prisoners filled that gap. They drove tractors and teams of horses. They pulled weeds and harvested crops through the long summer days. They worked alongside American farm families who, in many cases, had German ancestry themselves and spoke the language of their grandparents with a fluency that produced unexpected moments of human connection across the lines of war. Farmers' wives cooked noon meals for the work crews. Families invited prisoners to their Sunday dinner tables. Children played games with the prisoners in the evening, and brought them candy and gum. The guard assigned to one Nebraska bean field, his security post somewhere in the rows, was discovered by a farm boy delivering cold drinks to be sound asleep. The German prisoners, soldiers of the Reich, veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who had been described by their own government as the elite, fighting force of a superior civilization. We're not running. By the end of 1943, American intelligence officers were noting a development in the prisoner camps that their sociological analysis had not fully anticipated. The cumulative effect of the daily experience, the food, the pay, the fair treatment, the observable reality of American life that seeped through the wire in the form of the farmers, and the farm wives and the children, and the mail-order catalogs and the newspapers and the radio programs and the cold. Coca-Cola bottles sweating in the summer heat was producing what those intelligence officers began calling an ideological crisis. Not a sudden conversion or a dramatic political reversal, but something more corrosive to the prisoners. Original convictions, a persistent and growing inability to reconcile what they had been told with what they could see. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for an America of weakness and moral degeneracy. The America they were living inside was neither weak nor degenerate. It was staggeringly, almost incomprehensibly abundant. It was organized with a logistical efficiency that surpassed anything the Wehrmacht's planning apparatus had achieved. It was producing, by 1943, a volume of war material that German intelligence had told German commanders was simply impossible. Numbers that, when finally confirmed, had reportedly caused senior German officers to fall silent in disbelief. In 1942 alone, the United States had built 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, that number rose to 86,000. During the Battle of the Bulge, in the winter of 1944, American forces accidentally destroyed 8 million gallons of their own gasoline to prevent it falling into German hands. 8 million gallons, destroyed without affecting American operational capacity. Germany was then restricting aviation fuel production to a fraction of what it had been, experimenting with pine tree oil as a substitute. The men in the American prison camps could not see these numbers, but they could feel the material reality that produced them. They lived inside it. They ate it for breakfast. They drank it through a 5-cent bottle with a curved glass neck. By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners had enrolled in educational programs offered within the camps. These were not coerced. They were voluntary. Courses were offered by well-educated German officers who taught their fellow prisoners English, law, civil engineering, history, and trade skills. American administrators quietly encouraged this, understanding that whatever knowledge these men carried back to Germany when the war ended would be part of whatever Germany became afterward. But no formal re-education program, no lecture about democracy, no film about American history, no pamphlet about the virtues of freedom was as powerful in its effect as the ordinary, unscripted evidence of daily American life. The last ship out of New York carried men who stood at the stern in the dark and watched the city recede. Manhattan's lights, the millions of lights that no wartime rationing had ever dimmed, blazed against the October sky in 1945 with the same casual extravagance they always had. One prisoner standing at the rail, a man whose name history has not preserved, said quietly to those beside him, "It's like the Grail's castle, luminous, distant and imaginary all at once." The great city burned on the horizon like something out of a story, like something that should not have been real and was. They watched it until it disappeared. Then they crossed the dark Atlantic and went home to the rubble. What does it mean that a nation fed its enemies ice cream? It means more than kindness. It means more than strategic calculation, or Geneva Convention compliance, or the practical necessity of keeping prisoners healthy enough to work the harvest. It means something deeper and harder to name. Something that lives at the intersection of what a civilization actually is and what it says it is. The Reich had promised its people greatness through sacrifice, purity through exclusion, strength through the elimination of weakness. It had offered its soldiers a vision of the world in which abundance was a symptom of decadence and comfort, was the enemy of virtue, and it had marched its soldiers across continents on the strength of that vision until those soldiers found themselves sitting in front of a plate of food in Tennessee that they could not finish, holding a cold bottle that cost 5 cents, watching the summer melt into the mountains and understanding, in the particular way that the body understands what the mind has not yet admitted, that everything they had been told was wrong. The Coca-Cola bottle was not propaganda. That was its power. It did not argue. It did not persuade. It simply existed, cold and sweet and 5 cents, available to any man at any table in any one of 700 camps spread across a continent, that the Reich had called decadent. It existed the way. Freedom exists when it is genuine, not as a proclamation or a monument, but as a daily, ordinary, unremarkable fact of life. You can drink it or not drink it. It costs a nickel either way. It will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because in this country, this is simply what is available. No ration card required. No proof of racial purity demanded. No sacrifice asked in exchange for sweetness. Germany had fed its children scarcity and called it virtue. America had handed its prisoners abundance and called it Tuesday. When those prisoners went home, when they crossed the ocean a second time, carrying the weight of what they had seen and eaten and worked and learned, they carried something back with them that no army had sent and no government had planned. They carried the memory of that bottle, cold glass in the hand, 5 cents, always there. The quiet, irrefutable, undefeated argument that a nation willing to give its enemies ice cream has already won a war that no army alone could win. It had won the war for the human soul. And in the long, difficult decades of reconstruction that followed, in the economic miracles that rebuilt Germany and reconnected it to the world it had tried to destroy, the fingerprints of that American abundance, those American farms, those American mess halls, those American camps where men played soccer and drank cold Coca-Cola, and slowly, reluctantly, irresistibly began to see the world as it actually was, can be traced in every democratic institution Germany would eventually build. Not because America forced them to build it, because America had shown them, one breakfast at a time, one bottle at a time, one bowl of ice cream at a time, what it looked like when a nation chose to live without fear of its own abundance, when a people decided that sweetness was not a reward for suffering, but a simple human birthright, available to any person at any table, regardless of their nation, their name, or the uniform they arrived in. That is what the ice cream meant. That is what the Coca-Cola meant. It meant that some things, the most important things, cannot be taken away from a free people, even in wartime, and that an enemy who encounters those things will either be hardened by their jealousy or softened by their truth. Most of the men who sat in those Tennessee mess halls and those Nebraska farms and those Mississippi summer camps were softened, not broken, softened, as the first light of a different world they had not been allowed to imagine settled across them, slow and sweet as maple syrup on a Tuesday morning. They became, not Americans, but no longer quite enemies either. They became something harder to classify and more important than either. Men who had tasted what freedom tastes like when a nation is not afraid to share it, and who could never fully go back to believing that the world needed to be any other way. The lights of Manhattan burned all night. They always had. They always would. 5 cents a bottle, served cold. No rationing, no end